Okay. Dr. Williams? Dr. Williams? Dr. Williams? We're ready, okay?
I have to, it's wrong.
B. Okay? Very good. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to the Sausalito Yacht Club. We have a very interesting speaker this evening, and we'd like to get started. My name is Tom Kowalski. I'm one of the staff commodores here at the Yacht Club, and for those who are first-time visitors, the club was formed in 1942. We have approximately 750 to 800 members, an extensive racing program, a cruise program, reciprocity with multiple international yacht clubs, including the Club Duval in Cascais, Portugal, and sailing exchanges with clubs internationally to bring their youth that's trained here in Sausalito and our youth from Sausalito trained in the EU. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Williams, who's a graduate of the University of London in hydraulics. He has studied many estuaries in and around the San Francisco Bay, etc. And obviously the talk tonight is about Mr. Drake. Now, for this club, you can, for those who have been here many times, there's a very large photograph behind the screen showing, taken in 1973, when the replica of the Golden Hind, previously called the Pelican, came under Golden Gate Bridge. It was quite an event. And if you look closely, there's a model of the Golden Hind in the trophy cabinet to my left, your right. Also, Dr. Williams has some books that he brought for sale, and I encourage you to take a look at those. It's the holiday season. It's nice to sometimes have a stocking stuff. So kindly welcome Dr. Williams to the Sausalito Yacht Club.
Well, I expect many of you have already heard the story of how 445 years ago, Francis Drake landed somewhere near here and nailing a sixpenny coin onto a brass plaque claimed California as the possession of his queen, Elizabeth I. Drake named the land Nova Albion, which in Latin means New England, 37 years before the coast of Massachusetts was named the same. Drake's claim ignited enthusiasm for English colonization of North America in Elizabeth's court. Within a few years of Drake's return, maps were being printed in England, like this. It shows Nova Albion between, on the Pacific coast, but stretching eastward to the east coast on the same latitude, you see Virginia. And where Sir Walter Raleigh, just 5 years later, sent colonists to the territory that he had named after the Queen. So where is this important historic site, this Nova Albion? Over the last 150 years, more than 100 different amateur and professional historians have published documents claiming to have found where Drake landed. They have made arguments for places from Alaska to Baja California. The most credible ones, though, are centered on a location somewhere near what we now call Drake's Bay in Marin County. And 13 years ago, the National Park Service designated 6,000 acres around Drake's Bay and Point Reyes National Seashore as a National Historic and Archaeologic District. It had determined somewhere within this area Drake's landing site was located, as well as many ancient Native American archaeologic sites. Finally, in 2021, unnoticed amid the COVID epidemic, and after decades of deliberations, the State of California Historic Resources Commission decided on the specific location within the National District where Drake's ship was beached. It is now an official designated state historic landmark. My talk today describes the detective work that informed these state and federal designations. And much of it was research originally carried out or encouraged by the Drake Navigators Guild. The Guild was founded in 1949 by a group of retired sea captains and researchers living in the Bay Area. Like so many others, they were intrigued by the dramatic story of Drake's voyage along the Pacific coast, but they wanted to investigate it from a seafarer's perspective. Over the years, they were supported in their work by eminent historians and prominent naval figures. Admiral Chester Nimitz was the first honorary chair of the Guild, and in his retirement, he lived on Yerba Buena Island. To locate over Albion, we first need to understand why Drake was here. We must immerse ourselves in late 16th century European politics. In 1570, Pope Pius V excommunicated Queen Elizabeth of England as a heretic and sought to depose her in favor of her cousin, the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots. This was an opening salvo of a religious war that would eventually consume most of Europe. England was a Protestant nation standing in the way of a resurgent Catholic counter-reformation prosecuted most fervently by Elizabeth's ex-brother-in-law, Philip II of Spain. Elizabeth could not confront Spain directly. Philip's realm was far too powerful, a global empire with a population, army, and resources far exceeding England's. Instead, Elizabeth covertly sponsored raiding expeditions led by daring sea captains like Drake, hoping to exploit Spain's main vulnerability, its reliance on shipborne trade. In 1577, Francis Drake had set sail from Plymouth with 5 ships, ostensibly on a trading expedition to the Mediterranean. But once out of sight of land, he headed across the Atlantic to Tierra del Fuego, and then through the Straits of Magellan into the Pacific Ocean. This passage was a grueling winter voyage in uncharted waters against contrary winds. And here we see Drake's ship, the Golden Hind, battling the seas off Tierra del Fuego, what is now known as Drake's Passage. All the other ships were wrecked, abandoned, or turned back, and only the Golden Hind was able to sail north into calmer weather. But now, Drake could carry out his true purpose, looting Spanish colonies along the Pacific coast, from Chile to Mexico. His most successful exploit was capturing this Spanish galleon, Cacafuego, carrying much of the silver mined in Peru that year on its way to Philip's treasury. After 6 months of plundering, and now heavily laden with tons of treasure, it was time for the Golden Hind to return to England. Drake was reluctant to retrace his route back to the Straits of Magellan because he knew the Spanish were mobilizing forces to intercept him. Instead, he hoped to find a shorter, less arduous passage by heading north to find an ice-free route from the North Pacific back into the Atlantic through the Arctic Ocean. The undiscovered Northwest Passage that all his contemporaries in England were convinced was somewhere there waiting to be found. But after 7 weeks, battling contrary northwest winds and cold, foggy weather in the uncharted North Pacific, Drake was forced to turn back. The Golden Hind was leaking, and they were running out of provisions. There was only one other way to get back to England, sailing westwards across the Pacific and around the world. And before embarking on this 25,000-mile oceanic journey, Drake knew he would have to fix his weather-worn ship. So he turned south, blown along by the prevailing wind, seeking a sheltered harbor to rest, replenish, and repair at the place he would call Nova Albion. 14 months later, the Golden Hind finally made it back to the English Channel after completing only the second circumnavigation of the world. There, Drake encountered the first Englishman he had seen in 3 years, fishermen off the coast of Cornwall. When Drake hailed them, his very first question was, "Does the Queen live?" An affirmative meant he was safe. He would not be held to account for his undeclared war on the Spanish Empire. He had brought back to England, to Elizabeth, an immense treasure stolen from the Spanish-American colonies, and his own share of it would establish him as one of the wealthiest commoners in England. He need not have worried. The Queen was alive. She knighted him, made him one of her trusted courtiers. Sir Francis Drake became England's most celebrated naval hero, credited later for his role in the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 that frustrated Philip's invasion attempt and preserved both England's independence and the survival of the Protestant religion in Northern Europe. For the Spanish, Drake was a villain, heretic, and a pirate. He had stolen the gold and silver they had looted from the wreckage of the Aztec and Incan empires that their conquistadors, Cortes and Pizarro, had destroyed. The first place to look for Nova Albion is in old maps like this. They don't help much. The North Pacific coast remained in terra incognito well into the 18th century. So for a long time, cartographers used Nova Albion, or New Albion, to label anything what we now call California. The North Pacific coast, even in 1827, when the first hydrographic survey of San Francisco Bay was produced, you can see we are here in Sausalito. But in San Francisco Bay, well, we're not in California, we're in New Albion. The first rigorous investigation of where Drake landed was carried out in the late 19th century by George Davidson, president of the California Academy of Sciences. Davidson, an English immigrant, had formerly been chief of the U.S. Pacific Coast Survey, responsible for the magnificent detailed charts we use today as historic references. Mount Davidson in San Francisco is named after him. He researched 17th century charts looking for the specific place Drake referred to as Portus Nova Albion. And this was the earliest one. It is a 17th century draft prepared in Italy by the English sea captain Robert Dudley, whose father was the Earl of Leicester, a reputed lover of Queen Elizabeth, and a major investor in Drake's raiding expedition. You can see in Anchorage, where depths had been recorded, a bay of Nova Albion, and an inscription by an inlet that says in Italian, the best of ports. But where is this? The rest of Dudley's coastline is indecipherable. Drake was an experienced navigator who kept meticulous observations recorded in Golden Hind's logbook. And when he returned to England, along with the gold and silver stolen from the Spaniards, he gave his logbook to Queen Elizabeth. Now, the 16th century was an era of competitive voyages of discovery, so charts and logbooks were highly prized state secrets. Years later, when historians were trying to write the definitive account of Drake's voyage, they had all disappeared. Fortunately, Francis Fletcher, the Protestant chaplain on board the Golden Hind, kept his own journal. We don't know much about Fletcher, but he was evidently a keen observer of the flora, fauna, and people everywhere that the Golden Hind visited. His journal is the main source for most of the accounts of Drake's voyage, published in the decades after Drake's return. Drake's voyage around the world and his spectacular haul of Spanish treasure had made him a celebrity throughout Western Europe. People in London were eager to learn more about his adventures, and for a few years, some of Drake's drawings of places he had visited were displayed in the hallways of the Palace of Westminster. And it so happened that one of Europe's most skilled cartographers, the Dutchman Judicus Hondius, happened to be in London during this time. He came to Westminster and made sketches of what he saw posted on the walls. And some of these were printed on his best-selling chart of Drake's voyage that he published in Amsterdam in 1595. Hondius shows Drake's voyage around the world, his visit to the North Pacific, the approximate location of where he went ashore in Nova Albion, and then his journey back around across the Pacific, back across the Indian Ocean and back up into the Atlantic Ocean. In each of the four corners of this map are depictions of important events in the circumnavigation that Hondius copied from the walls of Westminster. One shows the Golden Hind aground on a reef in the East Indies, and two others show important spice trading ports that he visited in the East Indies. The fourth illustrates Portus Nova Albion. It was this sketch that created a puzzle, a mystery, that stimulated so many of the competing theories over the last 150 years. Everyone has tried to match it to their favorite landing spot, usually not very persuasively. The sketch provides no specific geographic location. Well, where did Drake think he was? The account based on Captain Fletcher's journal states, "We came within 38 degrees, and it pleased God to send us into a fair and good bay with a good wind to enter the same, and we fell in with a convenient and fit harbor." In the 16th century, before accurate clocks were made, it was practically impossible to determine longitude, but comparatively easy to determine latitude by measuring the sun angle at noon. Experienced sailors like Drake could estimate how far north or south they were on the planet's surface to within about half a degree, or 35 miles. So where is 38 degrees? Well, here's a clue. San Francisco Bay's most popular yachting magazine. But does this mean Drake discovered San Francisco Bay? And you might have thought so when the replica of the Golden Hind sailed into the bay, as we saw in this picture here. Here. No. The entrance to the Golden Gate is perfectly concealed. Even on a fogless day, you must sail to within about 6 miles to see the break in the coastal hills, or notice swells breaking on the bar that will tell you a huge estuary is here. For 2 centuries, Spanish ships kept well away from the rocky lee shore and sailed by without seeing it. The Golden Gate waited to be discovered from the land in 1769 by Portola's expedition. But if you were a captain of a leaking sailing ship running before wind along a rocky, unknown coast, seeking a safe harbor, you would hope to find a prominent headland behind which you'd expect to find a sheltered bay calm enough to anchor. Point Reyes is the first prominently projecting headland on the California coast. And this is what it looks like from a northerly bearing out to sea. A square-rigged sailing ship can easily round Point Reyes and suddenly find itself in a bay sheltered from the prevailing northwest winds and swell, with no nearby rocks, plenty of sea room to maneuver in case of a dramatic change in weather. Drake's Bay would be the logical place where Drake anchored. The depths here correspond to the soundings on Captain Dudley's Italian chart. And 38 degrees is exactly the latitude of Point Reyes. Well, why did Drake call this place Nova Albion? Albion is what the ancient Greeks named the island of Britain. Albus means white. A Greek navigator's first sight of England's shore sailing up the English Channel would be this. And this is what Drake saw when he rounded Point Reyes. It reminded him of home, Albion. Drake's Bay is a fine summer anchorage, but its exposed beach is not a good place to repair a wooden ship. To fix leaks in the hull and remove barnacles, seaweed, and shipworm, the ship must be careened, and this requires unloading and beaching the ship on a high tide, and heeling her over to fully expose the bottom to be retarred and repaired. This must be done in a sheltered harbor. It was such a harbor, near where Drake anchored. It is what we now call Drake's Estero. The Estero is unique on the Pacific coast. Since the 1960s, it has been protected against development as part of a Point Reyes National Seashore. No marinas, jetties, or landfill has modified this harbor. What we see today is very similar to what it looked like 4 centuries ago. The first question any seafarer would ask, could the Golden Hind have sailed into this estuary? It looks tricky, as you can see on this low tide photo. You must navigate shifting sandbanks, shallow tidal channels, and the ebb tide bar. Was the estuary mouth deep enough for the Golden Hind to enter? We know that how deep the Golden Hind hull floated in the water, because later, as Hongius had illustrated, she had run aground in the East Indies on a reef, and the crew measured it at 13 feet. Then in 1595, the Estero channel depth was measured to have been 16 feet high tide. Not too different from what it is today, and deep enough for the Golden Hind to be brought into the estuary on a flood tide. Drake's visit in 1579 is the first documented contact between the people of the North Pacific and the European world. This area supported a large population of indigenous people who shared a distinctive culture and language we now call coastal Miwok. When the Golden Hind appeared offshore, it must have been an unprecedented sight. Fletcher reports that the morning after the Golden Hind anchored, a Miwok man approached the ship in a reed canoe and performed rituals. In the following days, as the crew landed the ship's stores and constructed an encampment, hundreds of Miwok came to their villages inland, assembling on the hill above. They were curious to see these strangely dressed pale-skinned visitors. This was potentially a tense situation. Drake was aware that first encounters like this could easily erupt into conflict. Earlier, on the Chilean coast, when Drake's crew had landed to fill water casks. 4 had been killed by Abyssinian Indians who mistook the English for their hated enemies, Spanish colonists. He succeeded in establishing friendly relations with the Miwok by exchanging gifts and by inviting all of them to come and inspect the English camp unhindered. He was able to careen the Golden Hind without hindrance. And over the next 5 weeks, the two tribes mingled amicably, allowing plenty of opportunity for Fletcher to note the customs and artifacts of the Miwok culture. Many of his observations correspond with later accounts of the life of the coastal Miwok before Spanish colonization. For example, he was impressed by their watertight woven reed bowls, describing them as were hanged with pieces of shells of pearl and were wrought upon with the matted down of red feathers. You can see such baskets preserved here at the Indian Basket Museum in Tahoe City. The only tribes that lived on the coast and made baskets like this were the coastal Miwok here in Marin and their neighbors, the Pomona in Sonoma County. Fletcher also made careful note of the flora and fauna, the geography and climate. He recorded animals the English had never seen before, like the very large and fat deer, or tule elk, and the strange kind of coney, or pocket gophers. However, it was the summer fog and cold northwest winds that made the dominant impression. He describes the thick mists and stinking fogs that prevented them in a whole of 14 days together to find the air as clear as to be able to take the height of sun or star. Point Reyes has the highest number of cold, foggy days anywhere on the Pacific coast in July. Later, the Miwok took Drake and Fletcher to visit their villages inland in the Alima Valley. Fletcher contrasted the landscape there with their cold, damp encampments on the coast. He wrote, "It is far different from the shore, a goodly country, with fruitful soil, stored with many blessings fit for the use of man." And on the last day before Drake set off on what would be a 68-day voyage across the Pacific, he needed to complete his provisioning. Fletcher recorded the Golden Hind visiting islands not far from this harbor, where we found a plentiful and great store of seals and birds, gathering such provisions as might competently serve our turn of our. And on a clear day, you can, this is the view of the Farallone Islands from the hills above Drake's Bay, still abundantly populated by seals and seabirds. The latitude, the white cliffs, sheltered harbor, description of the Miwok, cold foggy weather, and nearby location of the Farallones correlate well with Fletcher's description. But this is circumstantial evidence. What's needed for an official historic site determination is direct physical evidence, archaeological evidence. Fletcher had recorded a precise description of that brass plate Drake had nailed to a post to document the English claim of Nova Albion. And in the 1930s, this plate of brass was found on the roadside near San Quentin prison. It was examined by famous historians, some of whom declared it genuine, and it was purchased and displayed for many years at the Bancroft Library in UC Berkeley. The Guild had mixed opinions concerning his find. It seemed too good to be true, and in any event, the artifact had not been found in situ and could not be used as evidence of Drake's landing location. And eventually, a metallurgic analysis demonstrated it was a fake. It turned out to be a hoax perpetuated by members of E Clampus Vitae, a secretive fraternal organization whose motto is, "I believe it because it is absurd." Credible archaeological evidence came later from an unlikely source, from China. In 1565, the Spanish had established an Asian trading post and colony in Manila. And every year they sent a ship laden with cargoes of silk, spices, and precious Spanish porcelain eastward back to Mexico to be shipped onward to Spain. Typically, these galleons followed the prevailing winds across the Pacific until they reached the California coast near Cape Mendocino, and then ran south to Acapulco, keeping well away from the rocky leeward shore. The Spanish wanted to know where the mysterious Portus Nova Albion was, as shown on Hondius's newly published map. It could be useful as a harbor of refuge, or by the English as a pirate base. And in 1595, they instructed Captain Semeno, commander of that year's Manila gang of the San Agustin, to explore the North American coast on his way back to Mexico. Semeno followed a similar course to Drake's. He sailed around Point Reyes and anchored in almost exactly the same spot in Drake's Bay 16 years later. The San Agustin carried on board a disassembled launch to enable exploration of shallow harbors like the one he saw nearby in Drake's Estero. It appears that Semeno sent most of his crew ashore to assemble the launch there, leaving only a few men on board. He didn't know that in November, the deceptively calm-looking sea off Limiter Spit could be hit by sudden storm swells from the south. And short-handed, Semeno was unable to set sail when San Agustin's anchor cable parted, and she was driven ashore and broken apart in the pounding swell. Semeno and his crew eventually completed their launch and then sailed on to Acapulco, leaving behind their cargo of precious Chinese porcelains smashed and scattered on Limiter Beach. In the 1950s and 60s, the Guild sponsored archaeological excavations of smitten sites for several Miwok villages located around the shores of Drake's Estero. And sure enough, parts and shards were found in many of them. Most of these shards had rounded edges consistent with being abraded by wave action on the beach. And then the archaeologists noted some were different, with brighter blue color and clean breaks. It seemed that these plates had been deliberately broken to create cutting edges by the Miwok, who did not have metal technology. The chief curator of San Francisco's Asian Art Museum, Clarence Chandra, was a world expert on the history and manufacture of Chinese porcelain. When he re-examined these shards in 1979, he could tell they were from two different cargoes. The bright blue ones were fired in the 1570s, the duller ones in the 1590s. The cargo of the last Spanish ship captured by Drake included 4 crates of fine Chinese porcelain. When Drake returned to England and unloaded his loot, there was no mention of the porcelains. And it's logical that Drake would have left these heavy crates behind or given them to the Miwok, because his ship was already overloaded with more valuable silver and the provisions needed for a long voyage. So where exactly did Drake land within Drake's Estero? It couldn't be far inland, because the Estero becomes too shallow. It had to be in a sheltered location where the shore was firm enough for careening. It also had to be consistent with Fletcher's description of encounters with Miwok, close to a hill and within earshot of a nearby settlement. Various members of the guild spent many weekends hiking the beaches and hilltops around Drake's Estero, until one day in 1952, Matthew Dillingham took a series of panoramic photos. Later, when he developed them in his darkroom, this one stood out. What caught Dillingham's attention was the recurved sand spit and the sandbank island beyond. It looked familiar, and he took another look at Hondius's depiction of Portus Nova Albion. It dawned on him Here he was looking at an oblique drawing of the landscape, not a crudely drawn chart, as all the other investigators had assumed. Dillingham realized he'd been standing on the top of a bluff exactly where the original artist had sketched in 1579. Now the drawing that Hondius had copied in Westminster made sense. The recurved sandspit, the shape of a shoreline, encampment on the ground below the hill where the Miwok gathered, and the sheltered bay suitable for careening. And what had made this landscape difficult to recognize was the constantly changing position of the sandbanks and channel at the mouth of the Estero. The spit and the sandbank islands erode and reform in different configurations each year. Dillingham had not only found the right spot, but was there at the right time. At a meeting of the California Historic Society in 1953, Admiral Chester Nimitz first proposed that this location be named Drake's Cove. And here is what Drake's Cove looks like today. It is State Historic Landmark 1061. I've now told you how Nova Albion was found, but this is by no means the end of the story or the only story. How would the Miwok side of the story of this encounter be told? Now, I understand the first thing the Miwok say is that only they can tell it. What the historic record shows is that after Drake and Soneno's visits, the Miwok's lives and culture remained largely undisturbed for another 200 years until the Spanish missions were established in San Francisco and San Rafael. Then, forced conversions, disease, enslavement in ranchos, followed by American state-sanctioned genocide, destroyed their way of life. Drake's Estero has now been designated a wilderness area, but this should not make us forget that this once sustained a vibrant Miwok population and mistakenly caused us to think the Miwok themselves were now extinct. And descendants of surviving Miwok have continued to live in the area, and in 2000, many successfully gained recognition within the Federated Indians of Groton Rancheria. Other questions have no fixed answers, such as why do we care where Drake landed? And that answer changes over time. By the 17th century, the legend of Drake's voyage and his claim of Nova Albion had inspired a vision of English colonization